Good afternoon, everybody. This is Brian Jennings. We'll get started here in just a minute. I want to make sure everyone that signed up can get in. Okay. My clock says 2:02, so I think we'll go ahead and we will get started. Good afternoon, and welcome to ACE's fourth and final webinar of 2018. My name is Brian Jennings. I'm the CEO for the American Coalition for Ethanol. Joining me today to do the webinar will be Jonathon Lehman, who represents us in Washington, D.C. I'll give Jonathon a more appropriate introduction in a moment. Just to make it clear, the purpose of today's webinar is to share analysis with you on what the midterm election results mean for the ethanol industry as we turn the page on 1 year and embark on 2019. We'll also include a few status reports, if you will, on some of our priority issues towards the end of the webinar. And then finally, we will announce the dates or share the dates for our 2019 fly-in with you. So we hope folks can join us. I think everyone knows this, but you're on listen-only mode at this point in time. Your lines are all muted. If you have a question for Jonathon and I as we go through this, there's an opportunity in the question bar to type that question in. And if we have time at the end, we will certainly entertain those questions. And if there happens to be any members of the media on the webinar right now, welcome to you as well. Glad to have you. I guess the only thing I would ask is that if you intend to write any news stories based on the webinar, that you give ACE an opportunity to consult with you first before publishing those. If you have any questions, you can contact myself or our communications director, Katie Fletcher. So with that, I'll give an introduction here of Jonathon, who's going to do most of the heavy lifting for the webinar. We're really lucky to have him representing us in Washington, and he's done so for quite a while now. The truth is, most major legislation that deals with agriculture or that deals with energy in the last couple decades, frankly, has had his fingerprints on it. Most notably for us, Jonathon helped write and pass the original renewable fuel standard, which was part of the 2005 energy bill, when he served on the staff of Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle of South Dakota. Jonathon moved on to be a lobbyist, and in 2007, when RFS 2 passed as part of the 2007 energy bill, he was intimately involved in the crafting of that as well. So he's a seasoned veteran. He helps us navigate the thicket out there in Washington. And as I said, we're lucky to have him, and he'll do the heavy lifting. Before I turn it over to him, I do want to say this. I realize for ethanol companies, it feels like maybe we're limping toward the end of the year here with the squeeze on with marginally higher corn prices and substantially low ethanol prices, with man-made limits on ethanol demand, with margins in negative territory. And we've got to absolutely do something to spur demand for ethanol here at home to make things right for you. And I just want you to know that that is absolutely on the top of our minds in everything we do here. So we're working to correct that situation through policies, through working with retailers, and it is absolutely our top priority is to increase ethanol demand. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jonathon.
Great, thanks, Brian, and appreciate everybody being on the phone today. If I start talking a little fast, I'm probably on about 84th ounce of coffee today. Farm Bill, as many of you probably know, kind of dropped late last night, so have been kind of diving through the various legislative language in the statement of managers this morning, just trying to understand what they did. Good news on that front is I think we're going to get a bill. Rules Committee is actually meeting right now in the House to kind of set the parameters for the debate on kind of consideration of the bill in the House, and the Senate will follow suit either later this week or potentially early next week. I think it depends a bit on what we do with the omnibus and kind of the negotiations with President Trump on funding for the wall. We wanted to kind of start today's kind of conversation just taking a look at kind of what the election results mean for us as we try to navigate into 2019 and 2020 from a legislative and an administrative process, as Brian said, to help drive and spur, kind of additional markets for our kind of biofuels and additional ways to chew corn and commodities to help, foster rural economies as well. This first slide, you look at it and you kind of see from a midterm election standpoint, we really had kind of a significant uptick in voter turnout in 2018 compared to previous, kind of elections, up near 50% turnout. Minnesota actually had the highest voter turnout at 64% in this election. And, I think what that shows is whether you're on the Dem or Republican side of the spectrum, engagement was high. If you look at the next slide, it just kind of gives you an example of kind of where those with kind of the highest voter turnout were. And as I mentioned previously, Minnesota had, kind of significant turnout increases across a number of the congressional districts. Turnout generally help move races to the Democratic side or kind of maintain a hold on a race on the Democratic side. So, one could draw that, kind of motivation, the electorate, kind of moved a groundswell of the agenda toward Dems. I want to caution that a bit as we kind of continue to look at where we are. The next slide kind of just shows you over the course of time kind of who's controlled the House of Representatives and what the margin has been. And, since probably the last 2 decades now, we've been really kind of right at the margins between Dem control and Republican control. The interesting nugget I'll look at is if you look at 2009, we had kind of a larger Democratic control. That's when healthcare happened, and that's when kind of the cap and trade bill, failed. And you look at kind of what moved on into 11, and you saw Republican control take over again over the course of the last 4 Congresses. Now we're moving towards, Pelosi taking over most likely in the House from a Democratic control, but the margin is not near as great as it was in 2009, the last time she was Speaker. If you look on the next slide, in the kind of the Senate, again, it's kind of highlighted how close it's been, and it's probably historically been a lot closer in the Senate over the course of time. Back when Brian and I were both on the Hill in 99 through kind of 02 range, we actually had a 50-50, 51-49, kind of split in the Senate and bouncing back and forth. And, kind of control of Dems, in the 9, 11, and 13 races, but, the Republicans actually, they've been able to kind of gain some ground, here in this last election as well. If you look at the next slide, it just shows you, kind of the breakdown and kind of the margins of kind of control both by the Republicans and Democrats, and it's kind of highlighting the kind of closeness of the electorate. But if you move to the next slide, kind of gives you kind of the graphical representation of kind of where we are in the House, kind of versus Democrats versus kind of the Republican framework. had on the periphery, a number of seats that kind of moved to the Democratic side. Similar graph on the Senate. Next, but you kind of note the Republican, kind of pickups to kind of add towards their, kind of majority vote. There's still not 60 votes to overcome a legislative, kind of filibuster, which, continues to be important for us as we kind of work towards kind of protecting the RFS. If you move to the next slide, you notice that the differences in kind of where we are regionally is, kind of from a Midwest perspective, kind of significantly red representation, Democrats who are going to control the House, kind of on the coast. And you can highlight that on the next slide even more, I believe, with the House districts. And you really kind of see the pockets of kind of blue and where the majority in the Democrats are kind of controlled from, and the bulk of the country in kind of red and Republican control. And what this means, I think, for us kind of politically moving into the next year is we're trying to navigate a Republican Senate and a Democratic House. Our base is largely, our base of operation, where our facilities are kind of largely controlled by the Republican, kind of conference, both in the House and the Senate. But, the policy and kind of the drivers of what the House is going to consider are going to be driven by these, kind of blue areas on the coast and, kind of some major hubs. And we're going to have to work towards messaging that is, kind of complementary to both. With regard to jobs, energy independence, rural economies through our Midwest, but then finding ways to speak towards, kind of the Democratic kind of coast as to why they should be caring about our policies and, agenda items moving into the next Congress.
One thing, this is Brian.
Next slide.
One thing, Jonathan, I might add before you go on is we don't get too wrapped around the axle regarding.
Have you moved to the committee slide, Brian?
Yep.
So if we kind of look at where we are moving forward on committees into the next kind of Congress, Senate, kind of control remains with the Republicans. Of note here is we lost Senator Donnelly and Senator Heidekamp, kind of two of our core, kind of spokespeople on the Democratic side on, kind of biofuels. We're going to have, kind of work to do to kind of educate their, kind of replacements and kind of wrap them into our strategies as the Senate being kind of the kind of the harbinger of where we try to stop bad things from happening in a biofuels policy. The only other note here, and it's not yet decided, is Debbie Stabenow may or may not be moving to the Energy Committee. And that's probably going to be a Schumer decision, and I'll talk about that once we get to the Energy Committee. The next in line on the Ag Committee would be Sherrod Brown from Ohio, kind of continued kind of a Midwestern, kind of presence, a little bit more to the left than where Stabenow has been, but has been a biofuel friend over the course of time. On the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, we have kind of Barrasso and Carper, that we've been working with or trying to position over the course of this last Congress. They're not necessarily our best friends at a leadership level. That said, we do have really strong champions in Fisher and Ernst and Moran and Rounds from a South Dakota ethanol perspective, and him needing to care about it on the committee. And that's been important to us with regard to our strategy on RVP and, kind of what EPA has been doing from a rulemaking perspective. And it'll kind of continue to be important. We'll talk about that once we get to the Administrator Wheeler's nomination moving forward in a bit. In the Energy and Natural Resource Committee, I mentioned this briefly. Maria Cantwell is likely going to move to the Commerce Committee, where she has jurisdiction over technology and airplanes. So Washington State, you think of Boeing and you think about the tech companies, and with kind of the Florida seat switching and Bill Nelson losing, that chairmanship is kind of open, and she is interested in taking that. Ron Wyden has already served as the Energy Committee chair and is on finance and doesn't want to move. Sanders is on the Budget Committee and doesn't want to move. Stabenow has said that she doesn't want to move from ag, but you look at number 5, Joe Manchin would be next in line to be the ranking member on the committee. Manchin from West Virginia, big coal supporter. There's a lot of hesitation about Democrats having him be the ranking member and kind of how fossil fuel oriented the Energy Committee would be. So there's still some discussion about whether they recruit Stabenow to take the Energy Committee slot in order to kind of prevent Manchin from doing that. And we'll kind of continue to monitor that as we move ahead. On the House side, I think the biggest takeaway for us is Colin Peterson will be back in charge as chair of the committee. He has been our kind of one of our strongest advocates, and the last time the Democrats were in control, he had Speaker Pelosi's ear on issues from the Farm Bill in 2008 to kind of the renewable fuel standard expansion as part of the energy bill in 07, and then trying to help navigate through some of the cap and trade climate change conversations and representing ag interests. So for us, this is kind of a key change and a real advantage for having him be chair of the Ag Committee and kind of be able to kind of use that bully pulpit to talk about the importance of these issues to rural America. On the House Energy and Commerce Committee, you have not a lot of change from where we were, kind of last go around, but for the fact that, leadership will be in Frank Pallone's hands as chair versus Greg Walden. Pallone he's not necessarily kind of a strong, ardent supporter of biofuels, but he hasn't been kind of a rush to judgment against biofuels in the past. I think if you compare him to who we had in Waxman as chair from California the last go around on the Energy and Commerce Committee, we're in a better position, I believe, on the committee with Pallone versus Waxman from kind of consideration of our issues. We do have to kind of be prepared for kind of a re-engagement on climate and, kind of green energy and, kind of work in that space. They're already, kind of positioning, trying to understand within the Democratic caucus, is this going to be dealt with in the Energy and Commerce Committee, or are they going to do a select committee that stands alone like they did the last time? Pallone wants kind of full jurisdiction and will have to be kind of aggressive in, kind of showing progress in hearings and other components on climate. And as we kind of foreshadowed in the previous slides on kind of the kind of makeup of where Democratic control in the House is, and it's on the coasts, not so much in our kind of strong political world. We're going to have to kind of engage on kind of smart conversations on these areas. And one of the things that we were able to do in the Farm Bill was kind of solicit and build some partnerships with environmental entrepreneurs, NRDC, the National Corn Growers, Minnesota Farmers Union, and creating a program within the conservation title on soil health that will kind of help steer NRCS to incent practices and study and really kind of look at the positive impacts from a greenhouse gas sequestration respect on kind of U.S. Agricultural production, corn production, from a carbon benefit perspective, and working to get NRCS and USDA kind of a stamp of approval on that. And that legislation was included in the conservation title that's going to to floor this week in the House and the Senate. So it's one of the items that we've looked at over the course of the last year and a half, and trying to re-engage in a smart way on highlighting the benefits of corn production, corn ethanol on kind of greenhouse gas, carbon, kind of policies. Moving from the Farm Bill, we're looking at kind of a status report on kind of the RVP rulemaking. We've been, kind of continually pushing the administration on this point, as collectively, I think all of us in the industry have. We had secured the commitment from the president that he was directing EPA to kind of do the RVP fix, and we've been working with EPA trying to understand better their timing. What they have told us over the course of the last, kind of several weeks is that they're not going to deal with the proposal until February because they have a lot of other things they want to do first. And they had mentioned RVP, the 2019 RVO reset as two kind of potentials to do before they got to the RVP. We are kind of continuing to push them to move more quickly. With the idea of that we need to, be final and we have the ability to kind of fix this issue before the summer driving season. They, kind of intellectually kind of understand that from a priority perspective, but they haven't necessarily kind of budged on kind of when they see slotting this in from a timing point. We're working kind of with our kind of champions on the Hill and at USDA to kind of continue to remind EPA at both the bureaucratic and the political level of the president's promise. And we're going to kind of continue that engagement. On the substance, there's two or three, kind of different ways that EPA could, kind of allow RVP from an interpretation standpoint to fix the issue from an E15 standpoint. We're kind of encouraging in all of the above, kind of strategy of, kind of include kind of every, kind of option in the rule in order to kind of be as robust as possible. On the substance on that, EPA has been engaged and open and, looking for ways to get to yes because they've been told to get there. The push back has been generally on timing. And I'll let Brian talk a bit about RIN reform.
Yeah, one of the things that I think we sometimes overlook because we are so laser focused on the RVP part of the rule is the fact that there's another half to this rulemaking, and that deals with so-called RIN reforms that refiners want. We don't have much to go on other than what EPA has conveyed to us in a couple of meetings and what they put on a document that was on the website for the White House back when the president made the announcement in October. And that is that EPA is likely to solicit our comments on a few ideas the merchant refiners have been pushing them to undertake with regards to RINs. 3 or 4 ideas that have been bounced around by the refiners include: 1, prohibiting anyone other than an obligated party from purchasing separated RINs. We believe this could pose some serious problems for the non-obligated blenders that are taking advantage of RINless ethanol, obviously, to help reduce the cost of it and pay for infrastructure and to increase market access. So that's something we'll be looking at carefully. Another idea that's been surfacing is limiting the amount of time a non-obligated party can hold a RIN. I think that's probably something that could pose some problems for some of these blenders as well. Requiring public disclosure when RIN holdings by any one actor exceed specific limits. That's something we'd have to learn a little bit more about what they're trying to get at. And then changes to how often and when RINs are retired. There could be other ideas that are included in this, but it's safe to say that this is, a part of the rule that we cannot overlook. We have to obviously be focused on getting the RVP rule, part of this rule done right and done on time and in a legally defensible way, because we're confident that this thing will end up in court at some point in time. But we also have to pay attention to the RIN side of this. And so it's just something that we wanted to bring to your attention.
So as we look to kind of implementation of the RFS, you know, I think we've kind of seen 2019 RVOs. We're continuing to work on kind of the small refinery exemption issues. We're in the process of the litigation on kind of the exemptions from kind of the previous year. We are, you know, kind of in kind of discovery. We have kind of a ruling from the court on kind of what documents we're able to see from a justification standpoint, what's proprietary business information that can be shared with our attorneys to kind of work towards the case. That kind of effort is ongoing, and we're in a kind of a briefing schedule based off of that discovery. And we're kind of continuing outside of the litigation to kind of push for reallocation of gallons with regard to the exemptions. I think we were all kind of collectively unified in our response to the 2019 RVO and highlighting the lack of EPA's reallocation on that front. And we'll kind of continue to, you know, kind of press that case as we move forward, independent of the litigation. The other kind of piece that's outstanding right now is the reset for the volumes. EPA had told us that that was the next thing that they were going to move to after the 2019 RVO. They had staff at a meeting kind of the end of last week where they suggested that that timing could be slipping a bit as to when they would push out a reset. I think in our minds that's good. It gives them some time to work on the RVP rule first. As we kind of communicated with EPA kind of staff, you know, they were like, well, boy, you want us to move quickly on RVP, but we got to do the RVO, and then you want us to do reset. And we're like, well, we'd rather you do RVP before reset. So we're kind of continuing to kind of press on that point. We've asked USDA to engage on that point as well on, you know, kind of trying to prioritize RVP. So we're pushing on timing. You know, the other piece that we're kind of working on is, you know, there's specific criteria in the legislation by which EPA has to determine volumes under the reset that they have to kind of legally look at. Impact on kind of commodity prices and rural economy is one of those components that they have to consider as they set these volumes. We're working with USDA to, you know, kind of help provide information and context for EPA in that decision. As you may recall, back when then Governor Perry pushed a waiver request in 2005 or 6 for EPA and the RFS, it was USDA and the Chief Economist's office that really buttressed and gave EPA all the data that they used to deny the waiver at that point in time. So we're hoping to kind of replicate that as they move through on the reset proposal.
I might jump in and just add a couple of comments here. You know, I think it's safe to say we can expect a fairly substantial relaxation in the volumes for advanced and cellulosic during the reset process. But if you look at that criteria that Jonathon alluded to, there's many different factors, sort of 6 broad criteria that need to dictate how EPA goes about setting those volumes for 2020 to 2022. I think it'd be pretty hard for EPA to justify doing anything less than 15 billion gallons when it comes to the undifferentiated conventional biofuel. And so that's good for us, but we're, as he noted, needing to work with USDA and others to really bolster our case. In terms of timing, it's sounding like this thing could slip all the way until the spring. And so we'll just be monitoring this. And as Jonathon said, we're absolutely trying to press EPA to make the RVP rule the top priority in terms of timing. And then a final comment on reallocation, because as you know, the 2019 volume figures are really, nothing more than numbers on paper if EPA continues to allow for these small refinery exemptions and then fails to reallocate the wave gallons to the remaining refiners. 2 days before EPA issued the 2019 RVOs, there was a report in Reuters that sounds like it is indeed true that EPA has put sort of a freeze on the entire process for small refinery exemptions, and it's undertaking a review with the Department of Energy, which it is supposed to work with, on determining whether a refiner that makes a request for an exemption indeed qualifies. And so there's a 90-day sort of timeout, if you will, on this process. That gives EPA until the end of March, which is the compliance deadline for the 2018 RVOs. And remember, there are at least 15 small refinery exemptions for 2018 still pending. And so they're going to have to act on those one way or the other. Clearly, it's hard to justify a small refinery exemption with RIN prices where they are. But this is something that we continue to carefully monitor, and I just wanted you to be aware of that fact. Moving on to the issue of octane and how do we position ourselves to access the market for higher blends of ethanol through the octane value that we bring to the table. There are a few things that I want to share with you. The first is the status of the final rule for the model year 2021 through 2026 CAFE greenhouse gas standards. EPA solicited comment on those standards this year. We anticipate a final rule will be released sometime in March. So March is going to be a busy time for us. Just to refresh everyone's memory, what EPA proposed to do was to freeze the CAFE greenhouse gas standards at the 2020 model year levels through 2026. I think the agency was surprised when, after making that proposal, they heard from the automakers that probably went too far for them. The automakers were not happy, of course, with the trajectory of the Obama era standards, thinking they were too ambitious. But it sounds like the automakers also don't want to see a complete standstill or freeze on these standards. And so it will be interesting to see where EPA lands, and probably the most important factor for them is how they're going to try to avoid a court battle with California. Of course, the state of California has a waiver to set their own standards. They announced that they intend to maintain the very ambitious, probably too ambitious standards that were set under the Obama administration. And so until and unless EPA and California can find their way to some sort of a brokered agreement, we could end up with these standards in court. And that would be very unfortunate for us because in the proposed rule, EPA was very careful about saying we want information and data on the benefits of E30 as a high octane fuel. And so ACE and everyone else that works in this space provided a lot of that tremendous data that we have from the automakers and from the Department of Energy about how higher blends of ethanol like E30 can contribute to fuel economy in these engines with higher compression ratios. But if we see this issue end up in court between California and EPA over the overall trajectory of the standards, that certainly could delay the opportunity that we would have to move to a higher ethanol blend in a high octane fuel. So that's something we'll be monitoring very carefully. Another issue related to octane, of course, around Thanksgiving, Representative Shimkus of Illinois, and Flores of Texas released what they call discussion draft legislation. They did not introduce it. It does not have a bill number. It's just out there in the ether for people to react to, which would, maybe the most simple way to put it, replace the RFS in many ways with a minimum 95 RON standard. Just so happens that this morning in the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on the Environment, there was a hearing to review this legislation. Some of you probably were either at the hearing or monitored the hearing. Our general take on the legislation, with all due respect to Congressman Shimkus, who has been a champion for biofuels over the years, is that the bill probably does a nice job of drawing attention to the fact that, hey, we really need to increase the minimum octane of fuel, but it doesn't chart a very adequate or sufficient course for how we're going to get there. In fact, about the same time that these two members of Congress released this legislative draft, EIA came out with an analysis that they had done for some oil companies, and it showed that a 95 RON standard is something that could easily be achieved today at the refinery level, using no more ethanol than is commonly found today. So no more than 10% ethanol in a blend. Refineries would just ramp up the severity of their reformers, and they'd be able to crank out that additional octane needed to get to 95 RON on their own. And so the legislation is certainly no growth strategy for us in terms of higher blends, and it's a pretty awful trade-off to trade limiting yourself to 10% of a 95 RON market by getting rid of the RFS. So, that's sort of our attitude about it, and we can work to improve upon that, I think, in the next Congress. And I think there's likely that this discussion will flow over into the 116th Congress, and so that's something that we will be actively engaged in. I think the last comment I want to make on this point is that we're not the only game in town when it comes to octane, and refiners clearly have their fingerprints on this Shimkus-Flores legislation, and they're not going to cede this market to us whatsoever, to state the obvious. And I think it'd be silly for us to walk into the ring and think we can go toe-to-toe with refiners on octane alone when we have another dimension to our fuel. Refiners and ethanol producers can both make octane. Okay, fine. The advantage we have over the refiners, in addition to price today, is the fact that our octane is always going to be a lower carbon ingredient than their octane. And we've got to make sure that we make that two-dimensional argument whenever we're having this conversation, because that's the long-term edge we're going to have over them, no matter what the price is of these various octane components. And so just preaching to the choir, hopefully, but just a point that yes, we need to keep talking about octane and raising the profile of octane, but we've got to do it in a way that also elevates or highlights the low octane advantages that we bring to the table. And then another update here on the trade front. And I know there are a lot of different trade issues that we could talk about, and I've selected a couple here that I just want to give you an update on. First of all, what is referred to as the USMCA, or sort of the revised NAFTA. And second, what's going on with respect to China. Regarding the negotiations with Canada and Mexico and recrafting NAFTA, for more than a year, the parties met, I think, 8 or 9 different rounds of negotiations. The leaders of the 3 countries signed a deal in principle at the end of November. Once a bill is unveiled, this is something that has to be approved by Congress. Of course, with Trade Promotion Authority, Congress doesn't get a chance to meddle with it or suggest amendments. They have to vote up or down on the USMCA. But of course, it's complicated a bit by virtue of the fact that the Democrats will take over control of the House next year. It seems like the president shouldn't have much trouble in the Senate. There will be bipartisan support for this in many respects, and there are sufficient Republicans, even if there are one or two defectors, that there should be sufficient votes in the Senate to get this done. But generally, how these things work, they're supposed to start in the House of Representatives in the Ways and Means Committee, and then go to the House floor, and then a bill would move to the Senate through the Finance Committee, which it sounds like Senator Grassley, by the way, wants to move from chairing Judiciary over to Finance. And one of the reasons he's probably compelled to try to do this is to help make sure that he can get this across the finish line. There isn't really anything new or different for ethanol in the new NAFTA. Canada obviously continues to be one of our most important customers. Year in, year out, Canada is either the top or the second destination for U.S. Ethanol exports, and we anticipate that will continue to be the case. Obviously, we have a new promising emerging opportunity with respect to Mexico and the fact that the country is moving to E10. I think a lot of you know that Ron Lamberty on the ACE staff has been able to use his expertise and experience to meet with Mexican petroleum marketers and retailers and government officials many times over the course of this year to help them get ready for that transition to E10, and we'll be continuing to work on that front. And then, of course, there's the China question and what will happen. At this stage, I think there are more questions than answers, to be brutally honest with you. But just as a review, at the G20 summit in Argentina a week ago or so, the president and the president of China agreed to sort of a 90-day truce, if you will, over escalating tariffs on various products. So that sort of delayed a plan that the U.S. had to increase some tariffs in the near term. The hope is negotiators can get a deal by the March timeframe. Certainly, there are lots of rumors about China maybe getting back into the marketplace when it comes to purchasing some U.S. agriculture commodities, which would be good. But there don't seem to be any indications yet from the Chinese side that they're going to drop any of their tariffs anytime soon. Obviously, for the ethanol industry, China is an absolute game changer. There's really no other way to put it. They can't get to their goal of E10 by 2020 without imports. We've heard and we know there were some reports today about the fact that China intends to dramatically ramp up their domestic ability to produce ethanol. I think it's something in the neighborhood of they're producing 750 million gallons or so today, or have the capacity to do that. And they want to triple that by 2020. That's incredibly ambitious. They're looking at doing it with a variety of feedstocks, which gets a bit challenging for them. And the truth is, they're still going to rely upon imports to get that done. But with an effective tariff standing somewhere between 70 and 75%, with the retaliatory tariffs that they tacked on to the underlying tariff, even with ethanol prices as ridiculously low as they are today, that still shuts the door to our product. And so what we have to see happen, obviously, and we've made this case to U.S. government officials, is that we've got to see those retaliatory tariffs taken off, and we've got to see some work done on that underlying 30% tariff. And this is a market that really would make a lot of sense for us to try and tap. So, exports have been a bright spot. I think everyone knows that. They've been a salvation for us. We'll probably reach somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.6 billion gallons before the year is out. And so we're going to need to continue, as we have some of these artificial constraints here at home to using more ethanol. We're going to have to continue pushing the exports and working on the trade policy front. Jonathon, you want to take this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've been dealing with, kind of acting Administrator Wheeler since Administrator Pruitt resigned earlier this year. Wheeler, a longtime, kind of DC veteran, worked for Senator Inhofe when Inhofe was chair of the EPW committee. He worked with Brian and I back on the original RFS and 0405 and was still there when they expanded what happened in '07. Has a history on a lot of these issues. He's also kind of given his ties to Oklahoma very close with the petroleum industry as well. He wants to take the acting title off of his business card and be confirmed as administrator. President Trump has nominated him for the full-time job. He's going to have to work his way through the Senate EPW committee with regard to confirmation and then a full Senate vote. He gets a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, having been the staff director on EPW in the past and having those relationships with some of those members. But at the same time, it's fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me perspective with regard to what an administrator nominee has to say on issues and kind of what Pruitt said with regard to the RFS and biofuels and then what he did. The good news for us is that, he is acting at the present time, so we can see what they're up to with regard to RVP and small refiners and the reset and on octane. And while they haven't done everything kind of perfectly in that regard, and there's definitely work to be done on, kind of improving kind of the prioritization within EPA on these pieces, he's not Administrator Pruitt either on these different components. But that said, kind of him working through the nomination gives us the ability to leverage our champions in a special way to kind of either move things forward or kind of get things back on track. And this slide kind of highlights, kind of the folks who are going to have the most to say in that regard. And Senator Ernst and Fisher, who really pushed hard for us on, kind of leveraging, kind of the administration in the past on kind of the RVP issue, working to kind of add additional voice with Rounds and Moran in a more aggressive fashion. These will be kind of the four that'll have to hold Wheeler to task, both prior to nomination, secure promise and commitment from him as to what he's going to accomplish, and then deliver and make sure that Wheeler's delivering on that at the end. So for us, as we kind of engage over the next year, these will be some of the targets that we'll be kind of continuing to help partner, kind of provide information back and forth, see what they need, encourage them to remain strong and prioritize kind of getting EPA to do what's right. And, we'll be asking membership as well to be thanking and engaging with these folks, kind of over the course of the next year to target Wheeler.
Yeah, and I might just add, a hearing has not been scheduled yet, but it is expected that it would occur early next year. And so if you're from Iowa or Nebraska or South Dakota, Kansas, if Kevin Kramer from North Dakota gets on the EPW committee, expect that ACE and others will be calling upon you to reach out to these key senators to make sure that they hold Mr. Wheeler accountable, and that EPA and Mr. Wheeler provide some tangible evidence they are going to reallocate those small refinery waived gallons, that they're going to get RVP done right and on time, that there's a glide path for a high octane fuel. It's a point of leverage that we're going to have, and we're going to need to take every bit of advantage of it. The last slide that we have before we turn to questions is on the ACE fly-in next year. Please mark your calendar. The dates are April 2nd and 3rd at the Liaison Hotel on Capitol Hill. Now, we have the House calendar, and we know the House of Representatives is in at this time, so We know we're safe with these dates as far as the House is concerned. The Senate has not yet released their calendar. I'm pretty sure we'll be safe with these dates, but we try to wait until we see the Senate calendar before we broadcast these too far and wide. But encourage you to mark your calendar and join us. I think a couple closing just comments before we open it up to questions is we don't get too worried about whether one party or another controls the House or the Senate, or whether one party or another controls the Oval Office, because we've always enjoyed bipartisan support, but we need to cultivate that bipartisan support. And over the course of time, we've lost champions in Congress, whether they've retired or they've been defeated. And it's critically important to cultivate those relationships through face-to-face conversations with these members of Congress and their staff. And that's precisely what the fly-in enables you to do. It gives you an opportunity to meet one-on-one with the staff people and the members of Congress that are making decisions on your behalf. We know a lot of our issues are before the EPA right now, and we will certainly have EPA officials invited to the fly-in to give us an update on where they are regarding RVP in that rulemaking, where they are regarding the RFS reset, and of course, where they are on the issue of the small refinery exemptions, the review that they're doing right now on that process, any changes that stem from that review, and most importantly, how they're going to restore some of the gallons or the gallons that have been waived. So there will be a lot of important issues. Really, the priority issues will be front and center for us early April at the fly-in. So we encourage you to join us and take part in that if you can. So with that, I'm going to click on the question button, and we will allow people to go ahead and ask questions if they have. And right now I don't see any, so Jonathan and I will just sit here quietly for a little bit, just in case a few questions come through the door. So. And I still don't see any questions, so maybe that means we've answered them, or maybe that means I don't know where I'm looking and there are some questions and I just can't see them, but so far I don't see any, so I'll wait a little bit longer, and if there aren't any, we'll Brian, what about Japan? Of course, Japan is an important export destination for us as well. Thanks for the question, Tom. I guess when we're facing as many constraints to using more ethanol here at home, we've got to look everywhere. And certainly an important development occurred in Japan this year that I'm guessing everyone is aware of, but if you're not, Japan decided, thanks to some lobbying obviously from the United States, they decided to make a change to the life cycle assessment that they use to determine the greenhouse gas impact of U.S. corn ethanol. And doing that enabled corn ethanol to be an ingredient in the production of ETBE. And of course, Japan doesn't quite yet allow ethanol from the U.S. to be exported there for use, but U.S. ethanol can now be used to help make ETBE, which is exported. So it's sort of an important step in the right direction, and I think work continues, Tom, to try and make sure that we can get to the point where at some point in the future we can be exporting U.S. ethanol there. I think I saw one other hand. Oh, maybe not. If there are any other questions, feel free to type them in or you can always, contact me or contact Jonathon or anyone on the ACE staff, and we can answer your questions after the fact. Here's a question. The market would appear to be significantly oversupplied. Have you seen any market analysis that states how many gallons of additional export or domestic bring us into balance? Great question. I have not. I guess the weekly reports that I try to keep up with show that we're producing at a pretty incredible rate right now, which is a bit surprising. I think it shows we're producing at an annualized rate of 16 billion gallons, and domestic disappearance is somewhere in that 14.5, rounding up or down a bit, billion gallons. And we talked about the fact that we think annual exports are going to end up in that 1.6 billion gallon neighborhood, but I haven't really seen additional analysis that shows sort of how many additional how many gallons of export would bring us into balance. So, we're just working on pushing and pulling all the levers we can to make sure that we do have access to the market, and that's what we're trying to do. All right, well, that was Eric. Thank you, Eric, for the question. Oh, wait, there are more questions. I'm just having a hard time. How can farmers in rural areas get their retailers to use E15 or to use more E15? Fantastic question, and oftentimes, unfortunately, we find that in our own backyards, we're not using enough of our product, whether it's E15 or E85 or mid-level blends. And I would just encourage you to begin a dialogue with your retailers in your area. Make sure they are aware of the benefits of ethanol. Make sure that they're aware that we're practically giving the stuff away these days in terms of price, and that they can distinguish themselves from other retailers by selling ethanol blended fuel, not just E15, but E85 and other blends as well. And then, of course, let them know that there are funds available to help them convert equipment if necessary, that there are experts at organizations like ACE and others that are available to help them if they need that help. And so I would just encourage you to begin that dialogue, and then let them know who is available to answer any questions that they have. All right, well, I think there are some more questions, but I'm wanting to keep this to an hour so people can move on with their day. I will take a look at the questions that have been asked, and we'll try to get back to you if we didn't answer them live. Jonathon, before we sign off, any parting words of wisdom you want to share?
No, I think I'm fine. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everybody, for joining.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate your joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.